Today we're going to be talking about all of the annoying little details of how to assemble metal models that are not from this decade. High-quality plastic models, either easy to put together or pre-assembled, have become the current default in a lot of hobbies that use miniatures. But it was not always this way. Growing up in the 2000s, it was the default for me to be assembling and painting metal models, with plastic models often being considered a downgrade from the high detail that pewter models were able to capture. These were annoying to put together and required a lot of specialized tools to do so properly. And if you're assembling any sort of metal models these days, that is still the case. Today we're going to be assembling some high-quality pewter sculpts from 2001's short-lived Chainmail Miniatures game, although these tips will work fine for any sort of pewter models that you might have. As a quick disclaimer, this channel is not sponsored by the Army Painter, but I'm going to take this opportunity to test out the Army Painter Hobby Toolkit, which is something they sent me about a year ago when I started up this channel, but I haven't really had the opportunity to use until right now. With all that out of the way, let's begin the video. Before we do anything else, we are first going to want to clean up our models a little bit. Metal models can often contain traces of a release agent, which helps lubricate the molds in which they are cast, and this lubricant can interfere with applying paint or applying super glue. So before we do anything else, we're going to give these models a bath in a little container that is full of water and a tiny bit of dish detergent. Using an old toothbrush that we are no longer putting in our mouths, we're going to scrub off as much of the release agent and dirt and grime as we can from these almost 20-year-old models. After drying them thoroughly with a paper towel or letting them air dry, they are now ready for step 2. Step 2, we are going to remove any sort of additional metal mold lines or flash, which is what you call that extra metal, I guess, from the models as possible. You will probably want to wear some safety goggles during this process, as if you get a piece of that metal shot at you and it hits you in the eye or something, that's probably not going to go well for you. For the very large bits, we can just use our hobby clippers to clip off these pieces. But for the mold lines and smaller bits, we might want to use our hobby knife to scrape them off. For a more detailed look at how I remove mold lines and things like that, you might want to check out Hobby Basics 101, where I do the same thing with plastic models, and it's a pretty similar process. Once we've used our hobby knife and our clippers to get rid of as much of the metal as we can then use our metal file to really smooth out some of those tough to reach or annoying little places that are hard to get off with just a knife. Once we're satisfied with how that's looking, we can move on towards gluing our models together. Gluing models together seems like it would be the most straightforward part of this process, but when our models are made of metal, this can actually be the most difficult part. So I'm going to break this down into a few steps and tackle each step as it comes up. Let's start with the most basic scenario. Single model pieces like this hyena can be glued to their models quite easily. If the model's tab fits cleanly into the slot base, ideally it should fit snugly and not be too loose. But some metal models, I might even say most metal models, have kind of a loose connection between the tab and the slot of the base. So we may need to reinforce it a little bit. Here's my favorite method for reinforcing the tab in the slot. Gripping the base stem gently using our model clippers, we are going to bend the pliers slightly, causing the metal base stem to warp at one end. Often, this is enough to hold the model more snugly in the base slot, but you can always use the same technique on the opposite end of the base stem as well, warping it slightly in the opposite direction to create an even more sturdy connection. Once our model fits snugly into the base, we can apply a little bit of super glue, and that's all you need to do. Speaking of bent metal, let's take a little sidebar to talk about bent and warped pieces. As we are going through the pieces of our metal model, we might notice that some of the more flimsy pieces, like weapons or spikes, might be bent. Pewter is a very soft metal, so it's very common for these tiny details to be bent or warped. But the upside of this is that it is very easy to bend these back into shape because, like I just said, pewter is a very soft metal. In the worst case scenario, if the piece is bent beyond repair, this is why we keep a lot of spare parts on hand in our bits box. So we can just always take a piece of plastic weapon or a plastic hand or whatever and just glue it on to where the warped metal one was. Returning to our topic of gluing models together, let's address the gargant in the room. When we're gluing together multi-piece plastic models, there's not a lot of issues because plastic is quite light. So if you glue together a flimsy piece, it's not going to break off most of the time because it's not very heavy. But with metal models, there can be some big problems because every piece is very heavy. So if it's not glued together properly, you can easily get a bunch of old models in your collection which look like this. Unlike these unfortunate models, we want to make sure that everything we put together is going to last for decades and decades and decades. So what we're going to learn how to do today is how to pin our models. In professional wrestling, pinning can be defined as holding an opponent's shoulders to the mat for a 3 count. In the miniature painting hobby, a pin can be defined as holding an opponent's shoulders to the mat for a 3 count. But in rare cases, when we say pinning, what we are talking about is drilling a hole to insert a metal rod into 2 adjacent pieces of a metal model, or a plastic model, or a resin model, to increase stability between the join. So I'm going to show you how we do it here in a few simple steps. Step 1, dry fit the bond. If it doesn't already fit snugly together, you might consider using your hobby knife or your metal file to file down the part so that it fits together more snugly. Step 2, you're going to need to get yourself a pin vise. One of the main reasons that I'm using Army Painter's hobby toolkit today is because my old pin vise broke and I wanted to try out a new one. And luckily, this little kit comes with a pin vise as well as several drill bits. This is what a pin vise looks like. It's a miniature hand drill that can drill through metal. It can also drill through plastic and probably resin. You're going to need one of these if you're going to be assembling any sort of metal models. In order to change out the drill bits, you're going to need to screw off the cap, and then you're going to insert any sort of thickness of the drill bit that you want to use before tightening it back on with the cap. To determine which drill bit you're going to want to use, you just need to first determine what sort of metal rod you want to use. You can buy an assortment of metal rods from hobby stores which come in different diameters, but today we're just going to be using paper clips because it's cheaper, it's easier, and that's what I have always used for pinning models. If you want to figure out which is the right size of drill bit you want to use, all you have to do is test it out in a block of wood or something, and then see if the metal rod fits into the hole that you just drilled. So ideally we want it to be as close in size as possible for our paperclip pins. Now, before we do any sort of pinning, we're going to want to use our metal file and our hobby knife to file down any sort of bumps that are in the way of the join. Sometimes the sculptor includes these little bumps to make gluing the model together easier, but these are not factoring in if you're going to be pinning the model, and it is much easier if you remove them before pinning. Once we have 2 roughly flat surfaces, we are ready to drill our first hole. However, as you can see here, it is sometimes challenging to start the hole. Sometimes it can be really difficult, especially if it's a curved surfaces you're trying to drill into. So what I like to do is, using my hobby knife, I will carve an X into the intended place where I want to drill the hole. The metal is soft enough that this shouldn't be too difficult. This gives the drill bit something to catch onto, and it makes it a lot easier for you to aim when you're drilling. Once your drill has started the hole, you're going to want to drill at a medium sort of pressure. You want to use enough pressure so that it looks like it is working, but not more pressure than you need to. Keep in mind that if your hand slips, or if you accidentally drill through the other side of the model, this is going to be going straight into your hand. So you don't want to be applying too much pressure or more than you need to. Just be patient and you'll get to where you want to go. Once we've achieved a hole of about 1/2 centimeter, or maybe less depending on the thickness of the metal that you're drilling into, we can take a length of metal rod and dry fit it into the hole. My metal rods, or in this case my paper clips, have a plastic coating on the outside, so here you can see I'm just carving them back a little bit to remove the plastic. Once we know that it fits, we're just going to apply a small amount of super glue and we're going to put the rod into the hole. Then we can use a super glue accelerating agent, which I don't have, but if you have it, you could use it here. Or you can just hold it in place for about a minute before setting it aside. I don't know if this is really necessary, but I like to leave the models to dry for about 10 minutes so that the bond is really strong. I don't know if that's how super glue works, but usually I'm doing a whole bunch of these in a row, so I'll be setting one aside to dry while I start pinning the next one. Once the glue has fully dried, we can use our hobby clippers to trim down the metal rod to a reasonable size. If you've gotten this far, congratulations! You have completed the first half of pinning your first model, or your second model, or your 1000th model. I don't know how many times that you've pinned models. I'm not a professional. Now we can go ahead and drill a hole in the other side. However, you might find it's hard to determine where exactly you need to drill the opposite hole because there's not a really clear way of aiming it. So I'm going to show you a quick little trick to help you aim your opposite hole and ensure a smooth join. First, we're going to take our metal file and we're going to file down our metal rod or paper clip. Once we've achieved a flat surface on one side of our rod, we're going to dip this rod in a bit of red paint. And then we are going to press that side of the rod onto the other side of the model where we want it to join. If you do this correctly, it should leave a little red dot on the other side of the model where we're going to want to drill our hole. And I just find it's an easy way of aiming our drill bit when we have a large surface of potential places to drill inside of. After that's done, we're going to repeat our initial process. I'm going to mark the area with an X to make it easier to drill, and then we're going to drill into the model using our drill bit. Once we think we have drilled deep enough, we can dry fit the model to see if it works. And if it does work, we can apply a little bit of glue and glue our pinned model together. If you've gotten this far, congratulations for the second time. This is the hardest part of putting together metal models. And even then, I wouldn't say it is a hard part, it is just a very tedious part, and that's why a lot of people prefer plastic models over metal models. Once your model is pinned and glued together, you may find you still have a significant gap between your pieces. If the gap is small enough, you might just be able to use super glue to fill the gap, but in this case, I'm going to recommend that you use some green stuff to fill the larger gaps. There are many brands and types of green stuff, including the mysterious brown stuff, which I talked about a few videos back. Regardless of what it's called, all of these types of putty are two-part epoxies, and once you mix the two halves together, they will dry overnight into a very strong bond. So they are ideal for reinforcing metal models. If you've already watched my video on making green stuff bases, you probably already know how I like to approach using green stuff, so you can refer to that. But for those of you who haven't watched that video, when we're working with green stuff, we usually want to use gloves and we want to have a shallow dish of water to dip our hands in. Today we're going to be using the small bit of green stuff that was provided to us with this beginner hobby kit. And as I'm mixing it together, I'm finding that it is a little bit old and hard to mix together. And that is the first downside that I've found to this hobby kit, which otherwise I think had some pretty good tools in it. Regardless, we just need a small amount of this, so it should work for our purposes. It's just a little bit stiff to put together. Once our epoxy is fully combined into a single shade of green, we are going to take a little bit of it and turn it into a tiny cylinder. Then, using our lubricated fingers, which we've lubricated with water, we're going to press the cylinder down into the gap which we're trying to fill. Using a sculpting tool like the one included with this hobby kit, we are going to press down on the green stuff, getting it down deep into the cracks and creating a smooth surface where the gap used to be, and then removing any excess and setting it aside. I would encourage you not to spend too much time making this look perfect, as we can always use our metal file once it's dry to sand it down. For some models, like this knoll, which is covered in fur, we can sculpt in a little bit of detail over top of the join if we want to. Here I am just sculpting in some random patterns that will look like fur when it's completely dry and primed. After we wait 24 hours for the green stuff to cure, our models are ready to prime and paint using a method of our choice. And that's about it. Those are all of my hot tips for putting together metal models. I was just putting together these metal models for fun when I realized how many extra steps there were, and I thought it might be useful for a lot of you to have a guide like this if you're putting together some old pewter models, like I have started to. If you'd like to see me paint these old metal models, please leave a comment down below and tell me how you'd like to see me paint them. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, please feel free to like and subscribe to let me know that this is the sort of content that you're interested in. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our supporters on Patreon. This has been my second month doing this full time, and it's really only possible thanks to your support on Patreon, so thank you very much for your support. This week, I would especially like to thank August McDaniel, Ash, Don Monroe, Walter L. Bennett, and Louis A. Camus. If you'd like to see your name appear or gain access to additional content, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Dana Howell. Or follow my daily painting progress on Twitter and Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.